Before the world knew the name El Chapo, before cartel violence dominated headlines and streaming series dramatized the underworld, there was a quiet strategist working in the shadows who would change the structure of organized crime in Mexico forever. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo did not begin his life as a mythic figure or a symbol of chaos. He emerged as something far more consequential, an architect who understood that power did not only come from force, but from organization, alliances, and calculated structure. In the turbulent decades of the 1970s and 1980s, when drug trafficking routes between Mexico and the United States were expanding rapidly, the trade was fragmented, controlled by regional smugglers who operated independently and often violently competed for territory. Gallardo saw opportunity in that disorder. Born in 1946 in Sinaloa, a region that would later become synonymous with powerful trafficking organizations, he began his career far from the world he would eventually dominate, working as a federal judicial police officer. That early exposure to law enforcement provided him with insight into institutional weaknesses, political networks, and the mechanics of power. Unlike many traffickers who relied primarily on intimidation, Gallardo cultivated relationships, learned bureaucratic systems, and observed how authority functioned from the inside. As marijuana and opium production expanded in Mexico during the 1970s, particularly in rural areas of Sinaloa and neighboring states, various independent traffickers managed cultivation and transport routes, often clashing with one another and drawing unwanted attention. The United States' increasing demand for narcotics meant that profits were rising quickly, but the lack of coordination created instability. Gallardo recognized that fragmentation was inefficient and dangerous. Instead of simply competing within that chaos, he began bringing major players together, positioning himself not merely as a participant, but as a mediator and organizer. Through diplomacy, calculated pressure, and strategic alliances, he helped consolidate disparate trafficking groups into what became known as the Guadalajara Cartel, one of Mexico's first large-scale coordinated drug trafficking organizations. This was not yet the era of sprawling, militarized cartels that would dominate later decades. It was a formative period, and Gallardo's influence lay in his ability to centralize authority while allowing regional operators to retain controlled autonomy. He understood geography intimately. Mexico's border with the United States presented numerous crossing points, each with its own risks and advantages. By assigning trusted associates to specific territories and corridors, he created a system in which responsibilities were divided, but profits were shared. Revenue-sharing agreements reduced internal conflict and encouraged cooperation, replacing unpredictable turf wars with structured partnerships. Among those who would later rise to prominence were figures from Sinaloa who learned within this organized framework, including Joaquin Guzman Loera, later known globally as El Chapo. At the time, Guzman was not yet a dominant leader, but part of a network that operated under Gallardo's broader coordination. The mentorship was not necessarily formal or personal in a traditional sense, yet the organizational blueprint Gallardo established shaped the environment in which future leaders developed their skills. He demonstrated that large-scale trafficking could function like a business enterprise, with logistics, accounting, delegated authority, and negotiated alliances rather than constant open conflict. This model reduced unpredictability and maximized profits during a period when the Colombian cocaine trade was increasingly seeking reliable transit routes through Mexico. As pressure mounted on Caribbean corridors in the 1980s, Mexican traffickers gained leverage by offering land-based routes into the United States. Gallardo's centralized coordination positioned his network as a key intermediary, strengthening ties with South American suppliers and expanding the scale of operations dramatically. Instead of isolated shipments, there was now a coordinated pipeline, and Mexico's role in international drug trafficking expanded accordingly. Yet centralization required more than logistics, it required political insulation. Gallardo reportedly invested heavily in building relationships with local authorities and political figures, creating layers of protection that allowed operations to continue with minimal interference. This aspect of his leadership reflected a broader reality of the time, in which corruption and weak institutional oversight created fertile ground for organized crime to embed itself within existing systems. By the mid-1980s, the Guadalajara cartel had become a dominant force, and Gallardo earned the nickname El Padrino, or the Godfather. not because of theatrical flamboyance, but because he functioned as a unifying authority among powerful traffickers. His meetings reportedly brought together regional leaders to resolve disputes and coordinate strategy, reducing violence through negotiated agreements rather than brute confrontation. This approach distinguished him from later cartel leaders whose power would be defined by open warfare. However, the stability he constructed was fragile and heavily dependent on his personal authority. Beneath the surface, ambition simmered among younger traffickers who were gaining experience and influence. The system functioned because Gallardo balanced competing interests carefully, ensuring that no single regional leader grew strong enough to challenge the collective structure outright. During this period, international attention intensified after high-profile incidents drew scrutiny from the United States government. The 1985 kidnapping and murder of DEA agent Enrique Camarena marked a turning point in U.S.-Mexico relations and significantly increased pressure on Mexican authorities to act against major trafficking figures. Although the complex circumstances surrounding that event involved multiple actors, the spotlight inevitably fell on the leadership of the Guadalajara organization. Increased investigations and diplomatic tension narrowed the space in which Gallardo had previously operated with relative insulation. For years, his strategy had relied on maintaining equilibrium between traffickers and elements within political and law enforcement structures. But the scale of international attention made that equilibrium increasingly difficult to sustain. As enforcement efforts intensified, internal cohesion began to strain. Some associates feared exposure, while others saw opportunities to expand their own influence. Gallardo attempted to adapt by reorganizing territories once again, effectively dividing operational control among trusted lieutenants in different regions, including Tijuana, Juarez, and Sinaloa. This division, intended to preserve order and reduce direct competition, would later prove to be one of the most consequential decisions in the evolution of Mexico's cartel landscape. By formalizing territorial boundaries and assigning control to powerful regional leaders, he created semi-autonomous factions that retained loyalty to the broader system but developed independent capabilities. In the short term, this structure maintained stability under mounting pressure. In the long term, it laid the foundation for fragmentation once his central authority was removed. Gallardo's arrest in 1989 did not dismantle the infrastructure he had built. Rather, it removed the figure who had balanced competing ambitions. Without a single coordinating leader, the territorial divisions hardened into rival organizations. Former partners who had once cooperated under revenue-sharing agreements now pursued dominance within their assigned regions. The blueprint Gallardo had designed proved durable, but it evolved in ways he could no longer control. The Tijuana organization, the Juarez organization, and the Sinaloa network each expanded independently, refining smuggling routes, building their own alliances, and in some cases engaging in violent competition. The business-like framework Gallardo pioneered became the foundation upon which these groups constructed more aggressive and militarized operations in the 1990s and 2000s. In retrospect, his influence appears less as a singular reign and more as a structural turning point. Before his consolidation efforts, Mexican trafficking networks were fragmented and localized. After his system took hold, organized crime operated on a national and eventually transnational scale, with defined hierarchies and strategic coordination. His leadership demonstrated that criminal enterprises could mirror corporate organization, complete with delegated management and negotiated partnerships. At the same time, the very efficiency of that system amplified its long-term impact. By professionalizing and centralizing trafficking operations, he increased their resilience. When he was imprisoned, the structure did not collapse. It adapted. Future leaders, including El Chapo, expanded upon the territorial model, introducing new tactics and broader international reach, but the underlying framework of divided plazas, revenue distribution, and strategic alliances traced back to the era of consolidation under Gallardo. His story is therefore not merely about personal power or notoriety. It is about institutional design within an illicit economy. Understanding his role requires examining the broader political and economic context of Mexico during the late 20th century, when rapid social change, economic challenges, and cross-border demand intersected with limited institutional capacity. Gallardo did not create drug demand, nor did he invent smuggling routes, but he reorganized the way trafficking functioned within Mexico. He identified inefficiencies and replaced them with coordination. He recognized that unity, even among criminals, could generate greater profit and reduce short-term conflict. Yet he also underestimated how fragile centralized authority becomes once the central figure is removed. The generation that followed would take his blueprint and reshape it amid shifting political landscapes and intensified enforcement campaigns. What began as a strategy to reduce internal violence eventually contributed to larger conflicts once competing factions no longer shared a single mediator. In examining the origins of Mexico's modern cartel system, Gallardo stands as a pivotal figure whose decisions reverberated far beyond his years of direct control. His rise illustrates how organization can transform fragmented networks into structured systems, and his fall reveals how systems built around personal authority can fracture when that authority disappears. The first chapter of his story is not defined by spectacle but by calculation, not by chaos but by design, and it set in motion forces that would redefine organized crime in Mexico for decades to come. As the structure Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo designed began to mature, the true magnitude of his influence became visible not only in the profits generated, but in the discipline that characterized the network he oversaw. The Guadalajara organization functioned less like a loose confederation of smugglers and more like a coordinated enterprise with defined responsibilities, territorial boundaries, and agreed-upon percentages. This level of organization was rare in Mexico's drug trade before the 1980s. Gallardo's strategic brilliance lay in recognizing that fragmentation created vulnerability. Independent traffickers were easier targets for law enforcement and more likely to engage in destructive rivalries. By bringing them into a centralized arrangement, he reduced infighting and strengthened collective bargaining power with Colombian suppliers who were increasingly reliant on Mexican routes to move cocaine north. The Caribbean corridor had become more heavily policed, and Mexican traffickers offered a land bridge that was difficult to fully seal. Under Gallardo's coordination, the flow of narcotics expanded dramatically, transforming Mexico from a secondary producer and transporter into a crucial transshipment hub. His network facilitated shipments that crossed deserts, mountains, and border cities, linking cultivation zones, storage sites, and crossing points into a seamless chain. The concept of the plaza, or controlled territory, became institutionalized. Each regional leader managed operations within assigned corridors, while paying a portion upward to the central leadership. This revenue-sharing system ensured loyalty and mutual dependence. It also created a training environment where ambitious younger figures learned the mechanics of large-scale trafficking within a structured hierarchy. Among those rising through the ranks was Joaquin Guzman Loera, later known as El Chapo, who operated within the Sinaloa network. Guzman absorbed lessons in logistics, discretion, and the importance of territorial control, lessons that would later shape his own leadership style. Gallardo's role was less that of a street-level enforcer, and more that of a coordinator who balanced personalities and ambitions. He reportedly convened meetings where disputes were negotiated rather than fought, reinforcing his authority as the ultimate mediator. However, this stability existed within a broader context of mounting tension. The murder of DEA agent Enrique Camarena in 1985 triggered unprecedented scrutiny from the United States and increased diplomatic pressure on Mexico to dismantle major trafficking organizations. The Camarena case intensified bilateral cooperation in anti-narcotics efforts and placed Gallardo and his associates under heightened surveillance. Although elements of corruption had previously insulated the organization, international attention narrowed the margin for maneuvering. Arrests of key associates began to disrupt the upper tiers of the Guadalajara network, and Gallardo faced a strategic dilemma. He could attempt to maintain tight central control under growing pressure, or he could decentralize further to preserve the system's resilience. His decision to divide territories more formally among trusted lieutenants was both pragmatic and risky. By assigning control of Tijuana to the Arellano Felix brothers, Juarez to the Carrillo Fuentes network, and Sinaloa to leaders including Guzman and Ismael Zambada, he effectively transformed the unified cartel into semi-autonomous regional powers. At the time, This appeared to be a calculated move to reduce the visibility of a single monolithic organization. If each region operated independently while respecting agreed boundaries, the overall network could survive even if one faction came under attack. In theory, decentralization would make the system more flexible. In practice, it sowed the seeds for future rivalry. Gallardo's arrest in 1989 removed the central authority that had enforced discipline and mediated disputes. Without his presence, the revenue-sharing agreements lost their binding force. Regional leaders who had once operated under a shared umbrella now controlled their own armed personnel, routes, and financial resources. The balance of power shifted quickly. In Tijuana, the Arellano Felix organization developed a reputation for aggressive enforcement of territorial claims, particularly along the lucrative border crossing. In Juarez, the Carrillo Fuentes network expanded its influence and strengthened logistical capabilities, eventually becoming known for innovative smuggling methods. In Sinaloa, figures like Guzman and Zambada consolidated alliances that would evolve into one of the most enduring trafficking organizations in Mexico. The fragmentation did not happen overnight, but the absence of a unifying arbiter accelerated competition. What Gallardo had once managed through negotiation increasingly became settled through force. The blueprint he created remained intact, yet its application changed. The plaza system endured, but instead of being coordinated by a central figure, it became the foundation for territorial disputes. Rivalries over border cities such as Tijuana and Ciudad Juarez intensified during the 1990s, leading to cycles of violence that drew international attention. The business-like structure Gallardo had pioneered was now wielded by independent actors whose ambitions were not constrained by a shared hierarchy. It is important to recognize that Gallardo's leadership style had relied heavily on personal relationships and reputation. His authority was not codified in written contracts or formal institutions. It rested on mutual benefit and his ability to balance competing interests. Once he was imprisoned, there was no institutional mechanism strong enough to maintain unity. This highlights a paradox in his legacy. By professionalizing the trade, he increased its efficiency and profitability. Yet by centralizing authority around himself, he created a system vulnerable to fragmentation in his absence. The post-1989 landscape illustrates how resilient illicit networks can be when structured effectively. Rather than collapsing, the organizations that emerged from the Guadalajara framework adapted to new pressures, diversified routes, and expanded internationally. The 1990s saw significant shifts in Mexico's political environment, including gradual weakening of one-party dominance and changes in federal enforcement strategies. These shifts created both challenges and opportunities for trafficking groups. Some factions invested in building more sophisticated intelligence networks to anticipate law enforcement operations. Others diversified into new forms of illicit activity, including synthetic drug production, as global demand evolved. The influence of Colombian cartels also changed during this period. As Colombian organizations faced their own crackdowns, Mexican groups assumed greater control over distribution networks, increasing their share of profits. This transition marked a pivotal evolution in the global drug trade, with Mexican cartels moving from subcontracted transporters to primary wholesalers. The foundation for that transition had been laid during Gallardo's era of coordination. His emphasis on territorial control and negotiated partnerships prepared Mexican traffickers to step into a larger role when circumstances shifted. The mentorship environment that existed under his umbrella allowed future leaders to observe and refine strategies before assuming full control. Guzman's later expansion into international markets, including connections extending beyond the Americas, reflected an understanding of scalable logistics first cultivated during the Guadalajara years. Yet with expansion came heightened conflict. As independent cartels competed for dominance, alliances formed and dissolved in rapid succession. The absence of a central mediator meant that disagreements escalated more quickly. The 1990s and early 2000s witnessed periods of intense violence in key border regions, driven by disputes over plazas and trafficking corridors. Each faction retained elements of Gallardo's organizational blueprint, but adapted it to its own priorities and leadership style. Some emphasized strict internal discipline, while others relied more heavily on displays of force to deter rivals. The evolution of the Sinaloa organization into a long-lasting power reflected its ability to combine strategic alliances with operational flexibility, a balance reminiscent of Gallardo's earlier approach, but executed in a far more competitive environment. Meanwhile, the Tijuana and Juarez organizations experienced cycles of dominance and decline as enforcement pressure and internal fractures took their toll. Gallardo himself remained imprisoned, yet reports suggested he continued to exert some influence through intermediaries during the early years of his incarceration. Over time, however, the autonomy of regional leaders solidified. The system he had once coordinated had transformed into a constellation of powerful, often rivalrous, entities. Observers of organized crime frequently describe Gallardo as the architect of Mexico's first modern cartel system, not because he created drug trafficking, but because he introduced a durable framework. His model demonstrated that coordination could amplify profits and reduce short-term instability. It also revealed that decentralization, when combined with ambition and weak institutional oversight, could lead to protracted conflict. The fragmentation following his arrest reshaped Mexico's criminal landscape, creating multiple centers of power rather than a single dominant organization. This shift had profound implications for law enforcement strategies. Targeting one leader no longer guaranteed systemic disruption. Instead, enforcement actions often triggered power vacuums that rival groups rushed to fill. The ripple effects of Gallardo's structural innovations thus extended far beyond his own career. His story illustrates how organizational design can influence the trajectory of illicit markets long after the original architect is removed. It underscores the interplay between individual leadership and broader systemic forces, including demand, political change, and international enforcement efforts. By the early 21st century, the cartels that traced their origins to the Guadalajara framework had become global players, adapting to technological advances and shifting consumer markets. Yet at their core remained principles introduced during the era of consolidation. Territorial management, revenue distribution, strategic alliances, and logistical coordination. The transformation from a unified cartel under Gallardo to a competitive ecosystem of powerful organizations marked a defining chapter in Mexico's modern history. It demonstrated that dismantling a central figure does not necessarily dismantle the system he built. Instead, the removal of a coordinating authority can unleash latent rivalries, intensify competition, and reshape the balance of power in unpredictable ways. The second chapter of Gallardo's story is therefore not merely about his imprisonment, but about the enduring consequences of his structural innovations. It is about how a model designed to impose order within a fragmented trade evolved into the blueprint for a new era of cartel dominance, rivalry, and resilience, setting the stage for the conflicts and transformations that would define the decades to follow. The first chapter of his story is not defined by spectacle but by calculation, not by chaos but by design, and it set in motion forces that would redefine organized crime in Mexico for decades to come. The long shadow of Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo's influence stretches far beyond the years in which he exercised direct control, because the system he helped construct became self-sustaining, adaptive, and deeply embedded within the evolving dynamics of organized crime in Mexico. By the time the 21st century unfolded, the organizations that traced their lineage to the Guadalajara framework had transformed into complex networks with international reach, diversified revenue streams, and sophisticated operational methods. What began as a strategy to coordinate marijuana and cocaine shipments through specific corridors matured into a vast architecture capable of moving multiple types of illicit commodities across continents. The territorial model Gallardo formalized continued to shape how cartels defined power, negotiated alliances, and defended influence. Even as new groups emerged, splintered, or rebranded, the concept of controlling plazas, taxing routes, and structuring leadership hierarchies remained foundational. In this sense, Gallardo's legacy is less about personal notoriety and more about institutional continuity within an illicit economy that adapted to political transitions, enforcement crackdowns, and shifting global demand. Mexico itself underwent significant changes during the decades following his arrest, including political reforms, economic restructuring, and intensified security campaigns. These changes influenced how cartels operated, but they did not erase the structural logic established during the consolidation era. Instead, organizations refined their methods, investing in intelligence networks, communication technologies, and diversified supply chains. The Sinaloa organization, whose early members operated under Gallardo's umbrella, expanded into one of the most globally recognized trafficking networks, extending operations into Central America, South America, Europe, and Asia. Its leadership style reflected a blend of calculated alliances and pragmatic flexibility, characteristics reminiscent of the negotiation-based coordination Gallardo once practiced, though applied in a far more competitive environment. Meanwhile, rival groups adapted differently, some adopting highly militarized approaches that intensified violence in contested regions. The fragmentation that followed Gallardo's imprisonment created an ecosystem in which multiple powerful actors competed simultaneously, often leading to cycles of retaliation that reshaped local communities and national security priorities. Yet beneath these conflicts, the structural DNA of the modern cartel system remained visible. The revenue-sharing mechanisms evolved into complex financial arrangements involving money laundering networks and cross-border investments. The territorial assignments hardened into fiercely defended zones of influence. Strategic partnerships extended beyond national borders, linking suppliers, transporters, distributors, and financial intermediaries in a web of interdependence. Gallardo's emphasis on coordination and organization had demonstrated that criminal enterprises could achieve resilience by mimicking corporate structures, and subsequent leaders expanded upon that principle with increasing sophistication. His story also highlights the limits of leader-focused enforcement strategies. The arrest of a single influential figure may disrupt operations temporarily, but if the underlying structure remains intact, other actors will adapt and assume leadership roles. The post-1989 fragmentation illustrated this dynamic clearly. Instead of eliminating trafficking networks, enforcement actions catalyzed their evolution. New leaders emerged, each inheriting pieces of the original framework while adapting to contemporary conditions. The global drug market itself shifted, with synthetic drugs becoming more prominent alongside traditional narcotics. Cartels diversified into methamphetamine production and other high-profit commodities, integrating chemical supply chains and laboratory networks into their operations. The logistical mindset cultivated during Gallardo's era facilitated this expansion. Control over territory meant control over production sites, transportation corridors, and distribution hubs. Even as governments intensified security measures, the adaptability of these networks allowed them to reroute shipments, negotiate new alliances, and exploit gaps in enforcement. Observers often debate whether Gallardo anticipated the long-term consequences of his decisions. It is difficult to determine how much he foresaw the scale of fragmentation that would follow his removal. What is clear is that his model created both stability and vulnerability. Stability emerged from centralized coordination and negotiated boundaries. Vulnerability emerged from reliance on personal authority without a durable mechanism for succession. When he could no longer mediate disputes, the system he had balanced carefully fractured along the very territorial lines he had drawn. This duality forms the core of his historical significance. He stands as a figure who transformed a fragmented trade into a coordinated enterprise, yet whose innovations also enabled the rise of competing powers that would redefine Mexico's criminal landscape. The generational shift from the Guadalajara era to the age of competing cartels illustrates how organizational blueprints can outlive their creators. Younger leaders internalized lessons about logistics, alliances, and territorial management, then applied them within more volatile contexts. The rise of high-profile figures in the 1990s and 2000s reflected an environment where ambition was no longer moderated by a single arbiter. Instead, alliances were transactional and often temporary. The competitive environment spurred rapid innovation, from tunnel construction beneath border cities to encrypted communications and complex smuggling techniques. Each advancement built upon the foundation of structured coordination that Gallardo helped normalize. His story therefore serves as a case study in how illicit systems institutionalize knowledge and transmit it across generations. Beyond operational details, Gallardo's legacy invites broader reflection on the interplay between state institutions, economic pressures, and organized crime. The environment that allowed his consolidation to occur included high demand in the United States, economic disparities in rural Mexican regions, and vulnerabilities within political and law enforcement institutions. Structural weaknesses and corruption provided space for centralized coordination to flourish. When international pressure intensified, the system adapted rather than disappeared. This adaptability underscores the challenge of addressing organized crime solely through decapitation strategies. Removing leaders without dismantling structural incentives and financial networks may alter power balances, but rarely eliminates the underlying market dynamics. The fragmentation that followed Gallardo's arrest illustrates how decentralized networks can become even more difficult to contain. Multiple independent organizations pursuing their own agendas complicate enforcement efforts and increase the likelihood of localized conflicts. At the same time, the persistence of certain organizational principles reveals how durable institutional design can be, even within illicit economies. Gallardo's role in mentoring or shaping future leaders, whether directly or indirectly, remains a key component of his historical footprint. Figures who would later command international attention developed within the environment he helped organize. They learned the value of territory, the importance of alliances, and the profitability of coordinated logistics. Even when they diverged in methods or escalated violence, they operated within a conceptual framework he had normalized. The modern cartel landscape, with its intricate hierarchies and global supply chains, cannot be fully understood without examining this formative period. Gallardo's influence does not absolve subsequent actors of responsibility for their own actions, nor does it reduce the complexity of later developments, but it clarifies the origins of structural patterns that persist today. As Mexico continues to confront the challenges posed by organized crime, the legacy of the consolidation era remains relevant. Efforts to reform institutions, strengthen rule of law, and address economic disparities intersect with the entrenched systems that evolved from Gallardo's blueprint. The story is not static. It continues to unfold as new leaders rise, alliances shift, and global markets change. Yet the foundational principles of territorial control, coordinated logistics, and negotiated partnerships remain embedded in the operational logic of many groups. Reflecting on Gallardo's trajectory also underscores how individuals can shape systems in ways that extend far beyond their personal lifespan of influence. His transformation from a regional operator to a national coordinator marked a turning point in Mexico's role within the international drug trade. The consequences of that turning point reverberated across decades, influencing patterns of violence, economic flows, and geopolitical relations. Understanding his story requires looking beyond sensational narratives and focusing on structural innovation. He was not merely a trafficker, he was an organizer who recognized the power of centralization at a moment when fragmentation limited growth. The irony is that the very lines he drew to impose order became battle lines once his authority vanished. In the end, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo's significance lies in the system he engineered and the ripple effects that followed its fragmentation. His era represents the bridge between localized smuggling operations and the modern cartel landscape that commands global attention. By consolidating territories, instituting revenue-sharing agreements, and cultivating alliances, he established a template that others expanded upon in ways both predictable and unforeseen. The evolution of Mexico's cartel system reflects the durability of structural design, the adaptability of illicit markets, and the unintended consequences that can arise when centralized authority dissolves. His story reminds us that organized crime, like any complex enterprise, is shaped by strategy, environment, and succession. The mentor behind future figures did not simply influence individual careers. He influenced the architecture within which those careers unfolded. And that architecture continues to cast a long shadow over the contemporary landscape of organized crime in Mexico and beyond. If you are benefiting from our topics, please subscribe, like, and turn on the bell notification so you can see our new videos early.